Hey, welcome to Lawrence's Soc AO3 final exam study video. I'm so sad that this course is ending, but with every loss comes a gain. In this case, summer, and for all of you, a lifetime of sociologically seeing the world around you, using concepts you learned here in class with little old me. Okay, so what I'm going to do, because I know you all want study guides. The first thing I'm going to do, in this video anyway, is I'm going to go through all of the chapters we covered in this course one by one. I'm not going to cover every concept you should know. You have to study, and that's your job, but I do want to frame this for you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each chapter, and I'm going to discuss what I think the key themes are. My hope is that for all of you, aside from just doing well in the exam, that you leave here having, a pretty good idea of what sociology is, and that you can really think about, how a sociologist would look at any of the given topics that were covered in each week and chapter in the textbook. So again, frame your studying around what I say here, and I'll end the video with some extra tips. So ready? Set, go! Chapter 1, Understanding the Sociological Imagination. Chapter 1 begins by describing the ways that the sociological perspective can help us see the world through the dynamic relationships between individuals and the larger social network in which they live. Imagine that I have books in these shelves, and there are people in social networks. Apparently, I don't have any books or any social networks. For example, the text points out that C. Wright Mill's concept of the sociological imagination draws our attention to the connections between events in our personal lives and larger social forces such as family, race, and income level. Other concepts include Peter Berger's concept of seeing the general in the particular and seeing the strange in the familiar. So remember, I began this course talking about my experience as someone who dropped out of school and who, tried to be a pro gamer. I often was trying to see, not at the time I was taking that for granted, but as I went back to school, back to high school, and then to university, I was drawn to sociology because I really wanted to see, all that stuff I used to see as familiar. I wanted to see how wider society shaped that. My choice to play video games, my choice to drop out of school, I wanted to see those as strange, and then see, why did I make these choices that I did? How much of them were structured by my family background, by my neighborhood, and as we'll see in future chapters, by the way I was socialized and all the little kind of quirks I developed as I was raised the way I was. So that brings us to agency and structure, two central concepts that were discussed in Chapter 1, and that, as we saw throughout the course, help us understand how we become who we are and why we see the world that we do. In addressing agency and structure, again, agency kind of being that personal will or volition, as we'll see, different philosophers frame this differently, but it's your sense of being able to have self-determined behavior and action. So, as much as I would like to say that I only dropped out of school and played video games because of factors outside of me, structure, I also made those decisions myself, and, overall, I think it's kind of cool that I did that in the past. And here I am now, sitting in an office with no books. Anyway, so agency and structure, the text itself examines how social factors like minority status, gender, socioeconomic status, family structure, and even urban-rural differences affect the development of an individual. So lots of things throughout the term, or the two terms, and the textbook to flesh out exactly what structures our individual agency. So again, we have this capacity for self-determined action and thought, but to what extent do our environments impact that? So the chapter then goes on to discuss the origins of sociology and notes that 3 revolutionary events inspired the rise of sociology. As you all remember, I asked you about this in test number 1. So we had the scientific revolution, the political revolution, and the industrial revolution. So key here is, again, thinking of the development of the Enlightenment in the modern West, ideas of the equality of people, the equality of individuals, that leading into political revolutions that cast off feudal lords and kings and queens and so on. And then the Industrial Revolution, the real kind of birth of modern industry as we know it, which now has given rise to, as we'll see much later on, post-industrialism and kind of the high-tech era. So then the chapter goes on to talk about, as you're starting to see, this chapter covers everything that we build on later in the course. Methodological approaches that are used in the discipline to study the relationship between individual and society are discussed. So namely quantitative and qualitative, or macro and micro, respectively. Again, remember, quantitative studies, typically in sociology, consist of big, population-wide surveys. We try to capture as much of a population as we can. And then qualitative sociology is a more in-depth look at a select few number of individuals. So for example, in my own research, I interviewed 32 Canadian salespeople, and because I really wanted to probe into how and why people in this field stayed in their respective jobs, or why they left. Finally, the chapter concludes with the discussion of the differences between Canadian and American approaches. Remember, we talked about some of the key things in Canadian sociology being the fact that it's framed around early Canadians living in a tough environment. And then we said, in the end, it's important for us to move simply beyond a Western perspective of looking at sociology. So particularly later in the course, when we go into globalization and environmentalism, we start to see, okay, many of the theories we've developed and that we'll discuss were focused on one place, often, early Britain and early America. But what would happen if we try to reframe sociology around different areas and using different theorists? So to try to consolidate everything we learned in chapter 1, again, this chapter is framing everything else that comes in the course. One thing you can do, and I'll end each chapter this way, with just kind of a big, broad essay question that you can think about, and I recommend you try to answer, because it will help you with your studying, I think, and also just to make this stuff stick more generally. So a question for this chapter would be, choose a general research topic, so like the family, video games, and explain how a macro sociologist, again someone more quantitative, or a micro sociologist, someone more qualitative, would each approach this topic. So again, what theory would they bring? Why would they pick this sort of sample? Would their interests maybe be different? And then what would the research look like, and what might they potentially find? Again, just things to drive the centrality of all these themes together. Okay, 1 down, 19 to go. Chapter 2, Classical Theories. So as you know, this chapter introduces you to a wide array of theories, particularly the 3 that we keep coming back to just about every lecture. Functionalism, Durkheim, conflict theory, Marx, and symbolic interactionism, often Max Weber, but often too Georg Simmel and George Herbert Mead. It also introduces some of the thinkers, of course, that introduce this approach. So those are the ones that are related. Some of them, they go in more depth and some not. Again, those are the ones, Mead sometimes comes in the contemporary part in other courses. But I would say thinking of thinking of Marx, Weber, and Durkheim in particular, those are the ones that in this course we've really emphasized the most. So here you learn that a theory is a statement that tries to explain how certain facts or variables are related in order to predict future events. Many of you may have initially found it difficult to understand the relevance of classical theories in today's modern world. But as we all saw throughout the course, again, I noted on both of your midterms, many of you stating, how much you like theory and how it's so applicable to so many things. I think over the year, we've really seen how these theories can help us understand contemporary social issues. So as you'll recall, to explain the theoretical approaches within sociology, like I mentioned in chapter 1, we started with the Enlightenment and how this moment, again, of people like literally feeling enlightened mentally, casting off prior ways of social order, such as religion and certain political ways of acting, often very hierarchical, top-down. The Enlightenment kind of necessitated sociological thought for the first time. There's always been some sociologizing, but this was the birth of modern sociology as we know it and as I'm teaching it in this class. And so we also learned about a few of the philosophical underpinnings of sociology. So the ideas of Newton and really like scientific inquiry, Hobbes and Locke on the nature of political order, and Rousseau, who kind of challenged some of the former thinkers' ideas in different ways. So doing so, again, was not meant to confuse you or make this a big history or philosophy class. As you'll see, we always kind of go back to this moment, the Enlightenment, then followed by these political revolutions and these thinkers here, and the Industrial Revolution. This is just meant to put everything in context for you so that you can see that sociology came out of this moment of high thought and high change. So now the three big theories I mentioned earlier. So again, this will help you with other chapters too, and we'll keep revisiting these. So functionalism is discussed as one of the three major sociological theories. And here the work of Durkheim and Parsons is emphasized. Again, Parsons is often more contemporary, coming after the early 20th century, but Durkheim is writing in the 1900s, mostly. And so functionalists see the social world from a macro level analysis. Again, they kind of start with society, and they emphasize that society is a system of interrelated and interdependent parts. So to a functionalist, a society is like an organism. Remember the organic analogy we always talked about. And it functions because it has an established equilibrium because it's between its parts. So remember here, the social order, the society itself is a body. For functionalists. That's why they're often resistant to change, because they think like, oh, okay, well, maybe I don't know what my lung does because I haven't figured that out yet, but thank God I didn't take it out, because if I did, I would have died because I wouldn't be able to breathe, right? So that's often what they do when they look at things historically. They say, well, people don't always know the real function of the organs of society. They don't really know the functions of the institutions that we have. We may just see the most obvious one, but we don't necessarily know what else the thing could be doing. So conflict theory, by contrast, is represented by Karl Marx and his buddy Friedrich Engels. And it's noted as kind of the key competing theoretical school. It also uses macro-level analysis and kind of pioneered more with quantitative methods. But unlike functionalism, which is looking at interdependence and interrelation, conflict theory flips that around and sees kind of the basis of society. Remember, the history of all society is a history of class struggles. So this idea means we need to base society and study of society on inequality and competition. And here we have groups of individuals fighting over scarce resources, and which ultimately leads to conflict, hence conflict theory. So again, functionalism is looking at how things ultimately function to serve individuals. Conflict theory is looking at how the things that we have, the things that we've done, are all centered around conflict and ultimately create conflict. Lastly, symbolic interactionism can be very easily distinguished from functionalism and conflict theory. First, in the sense that it's typically micro-sociological. So as we'll see, this school heavily draws on early social psychology, so the work of Mead and Cooley and Zimmel. Zimmel's not a social psychologist, but his ideas lend themselves that way very often. And so it's very inspired by micro-sociological ideas, and then B, because of that, it's much less overtly grand theoretical. So it doesn't make big claims and it doesn't have huge stakes about the nature of society, either being based on integration or conflict, but instead looks at meaning as it's constructed by individuals. So for example, we live in a society with a big education system. Functionalists may kind of a priori or ahead of time assume that education is filling a lot of important functions. Conflict theorists may agree with that, but also see it as problematic and creating divisions. Symbolic interactionists, they may take a position on one of those two sides, but they're just more interested in seeing how people actually interact with the education system, how they feel about it, and how it influences their lives. So the question of this chapter, just to think about, so what did Durkheim mean when he talked about, for example, the 4 kinds of suicide? Or the 4 types of suicide. Remember, think of him as a functionalist. Compare and contrast the 4 types that he identified. Which type do you think would be most common among your general age group in Canada? Explain your decision. So again, I'll give you questions at the end of the chapters to have you think through some of the things. Remember, Durkheim, a functionalist. Why did he study suicide? What did I say in class that it kind of represented? Remember, something that seemed very individual, but was actually socially influenced. How does he typologize that? And how could that make sense today? Chapter 3, contemporary theories. So moving forward in time. While the contemporary social theories that are discussed in Chapter 3 build on the ones we just talked about in Chapter 2, we noticed in class that this chapter really emphasizes power as a predominant theory in contemporary theory, or a predominant concept. So in a way, we kind of see the winning of conflict theory here in terms of this influence. So the key contemporary theories that are discussed here that all share an emphasis on power are Western Marxism, feminism, post-structuralism, queer theory, post-colonial theory, and critical race theory. So the chapter begins with a study of Gramsci's concept of hegemony. So here it's the idea that the ideology of the ruling class is the mechanism by which this class rules society. Remember here there was a huge distinction between power and domination. So domination was usually a kind of brute physical force. So like, I don't like you, water bottle. Like something like that. Domination. I just dominated my poor little water bottle. Power, on the other hand, is more ideological, meaning that I can actually get the water bottle to consent to me having like ownership of it. I'm not using an example that really makes a lot of sense, but remember we talked about the higher education system, and in test 1 I asked you how might higher education be hegemonic, and I said, well, it's not that anyone's forcing you to go to university, but it does exert power over your life. How? Because of all the hegemonic ideas that we have in our society about the role of education. It's just taken for granted that you should go to school. Again, I dropped out of school and I definitely felt social pressure, individualized pressure. I just kind of felt out of it for not being in school. So, if you're taking a conflict approach, as we'll see, or a Western Marxist approach, the idea of hegemony lets you see how many of your choices that you kind of feel a bit pressured to do, you're not exactly being dominated, but you're being kind of implicitly influenced very strongly at times by the ideas of other people who often are in positions of power or have been historically. So feminism and its 3 waves are surveyed in the text. However, the text does talk a lot more about second wave and third wave feminism. Remember, second wave we associated with Dorothy Smith, mainly looking at how, following many of the classical theories, but centering it more around women's experiences. She looked at how individuals' relations and their ideas of self are very much influenced by their relations with other people and the context they find themselves in. And then bell hooks criticized second wave feminism and emphasized that race is inseparable from gender. So second wave feminism again started to center women in the center of analysis. So they were seeing or position women in the center of sociological analysis. Dorothy Smith wanted to create what was called sociology for women, or a women's sociology, where she kind of, in a thought experiment, imagined like what would it look like if we developed this discipline or other disciplines from the standpoint of women. So many of our theories are implicitly relying on men's perspectives and the social context they find themselves in. What if we started from women? And then bell hooks criticized not her specifically, but more the movement that she was a part of, saying, I understand the idea of starting from women's perspective, but are all women really the same in terms of the context they inhabit? So do white women and black women, for example, inhabit the same spaces? Do they experience the same sorts of privileges and stigmas and so on? Seeing that that's not always the case led her and many other thinkers to kind of deconstruct this concept of quote-unquote women. So this idea of deconstruction is very much inspired and also led to the movement that's called post-structuralism. And sometimes, it's different, but can also be seen as postmodernism in more literary fields. So Foucault is the key person here, and this also leads into queer theory too. So here we see issues of desire, language, identity play. All of these start to come in of us really unpacking the kind of social constructions that are around us, the institutions, asking, why do we have, why is marriage seen typically as between a man and a woman? Yes, historically it's been that way, but has it have to, in our area, but has it have to have, or does it have to have always been that way? Those are the sorts of questions that post-structuralists ask. They're, in a way, moving away from structure and saying, okay, we're structured by so many things in our lives, but to what extent can we actually see ourselves beyond that structure? Post-colonial theory emphasizes this very strongly by looking at the impact of politics and culture on individuals. So Edward Said, for example, looks at Orientalism. Remember the concept that Eastern individuals and the East in general have typically been constructed as inferior to Western individuals in the West, again with an eye to seeing, okay, historically this is a process that has happened, but do we have to keep framing things this way? Do we have to keep structuring things this way? And finally, critical race theory sees racism as a central and foundational feature of American social relations, again with an eye to isolating a structure that's been shaping individuals' lives differently, and then opening up questions in regards to what we can actually do to change these historical facts. So a question for this chapter would be, how do distinct groups like women, visible minorities, and non-Western scholars introduce viewpoints into sociology that are beneficial to us in terms of understanding the social world? Without such standpoints, would sociology be able to produce an accurate understanding of the social world? So remember, in this chapter, we built on classical theories, but one of the central things we did was introduce power. So then when we look at, or carry on the theme of power from conflict theory, when we think of power, we then have to think of individual standpoints in society. Without the voice of minorities, including women and non-white individuals in the Canadian context, racial minorities, invisible minorities. Without these voices, what do you think sociology would look like? Would it be very accurate? Another way of wording this is, what are the benefits that come out of looking at the world through different standpoints? Again, try to link this to the sociological imagination more broadly, just to keep the concepts gelling. Okay, so chapter 4, research methods. So chapter 4 helps you now connect the theories you just learned in the classical and contemporary chapters to the actual sociological research methods that we use. So key in this connection, because it may seem, okay, Sierra Mills, for one, always talks about how there was a big disconnect between theory and method. But this chapter really tries to get you to see that the research that any scholar conducts is very much underlined by the kind of theoretical assumptions that they make. So the two key kinds of methods that are introduced also have two attendant logics that go with them, again, to make this connection. So on the one hand, methodologically, we have quantitative research, again, large scale, using the logic of numbers, numerical analysis, versus qualitative approaches that tend to be more small scale and based on richer description. Quantitative method relies on deductive systems of logic, or deductive logic. So you have an idea and you want to deduce its validity through proving it through statistics. Qualitative methods tend to rely on inductive logic, which is going into an area with less assumptions and then trying to build an argument based on what you see. So the chapter surveys essential research concepts such as hypotheses, independent and dependent variables, validity and reliability, operational definitions, correlation and causality, and research population. Again, all of these definitions are in the textbook, and we've gone over many of them. You also learn about methods such as surveys, interviews, participant observation, content analysis, secondary analysis, and participatory action research. And finally, it talks about some biases and ethical debates that can happen in sociology and have happened. So remember Milgram's obedience study, Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment, and Ogden's assisted suicide study. So I didn't go quite as much in depth in this chapter in terms of all of the methods. Again, I covered these in lecture. I would go over my lecture notes to see particularly what these are. Also because I kind of spent a lot of time on the earlier chapters that I think will frame things better. But here you just want to think again, okay, conflict theory, functionalism were seen as macro theories. Very often then people that are using these theories as their guidelines will turn to quantitative studies because they want to prove big kind of societal level arguments. Individuals drawing on symbolic interactionism are usually trying to figure out how a process works, and then so that will lead them to induce through a process of, like what I did in interviewing 32 people. I kind of just wanted to know, without that many assumptions, how people thought about having jobs they didn't see as very good. So if you want to prove an argument ahead of time, it often makes more sense to use quantitative. So let's say I say, okay, I think that this group of people will earn less money because of this other reason. You can prove that through statistical analysis. If you're more exploratory or you really want to flesh out a process, so, sure, I think that certain kinds of individuals are more likely to feel addicted to video games, but I really want to know how and why. It may make more sense for me to go out and study those people, do an ethnography, do in-depth interviews. Again, these are not dogmatic. You could do these other ways, but it's all about picking the method that you think will actually help you get at the research question you want to ask and have answered. So on that note, question for this chapter: imagine that you're conducting a study about whether women or men are currently portrayed in stereotypical gender roles. So are men and women being portrayed in stereotypical gender roles and personality characteristics on commercials on Canadian TV stations. How might you go about doing this research? Which research method would make the most sense for this type of study? What type of product will the type of product advertised make a difference? What about the type of show during which the commercial is shown? Are there any other factors which you should be aware of while doing this research? Explain and provide as much detail as possible. Again, you don't have to necessarily think about this example, but just think of a topic. Why would you choose quantitative or qualitative methods? Then within those, why would you choose, say, surveys or ethnography? And what other factors impact that choice? What theories are you drawing on? What outcomes do you maybe expect to see? Okay, so those were the more foundational chapters of the text. Again, we've had the introduction, classical theory, contemporary theory, and methods. So now we start getting into the more specific, substantive topics. Okay, so culture. And just as a note, these more substantive chapters that are coming next will all tend to be shorter than the ones we just covered. So don't worry, this isn't going to be like a 3-hour-long video. So culture. Understanding culture and its components and the way that it's transmitted is at the heart of sociology. So as you know, this chapter in the week, or that we covered it, were intended to help you develop an appreciation for the complexity of culture, including its defining features, how it emerged, the process of culture change, and the impact it has on our lives. So we were introduced to quite a bit of terminology here, but some I'll explain, and other ones I think you can turn to the text or the lectures to get more of, are the following. So culture itself, which we'll see, first can be seen as consisting of material and non-material culture. So for an example, material culture, Tim Hortons, it's seen as a symbol of Canada. Many people, equate things like Tim Hortons coffee and maple syrup with the culture. Versus non-material culture, so things like the national anthem and maybe Canadian values like saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, too much." So concepts like subculture and counterculture were also discussed. So if you see a wider culture, or a culture in general, as the body of norms, values, and laws, and kind of folkways and taboos and languages and symbols that a society has, then subcultures are pockets of that. So you could have like a gaming subculture. These are people who have norms around playing video games a lot. They value video games maybe more than value working or family or something else. and they use different symbols. So instead of, going around and saying, hey, it's lit, fam, or whatever, I don't know what people say anymore, they may talk about poning noobs or something. And then the issue of cultural universalists came up too, along with the idea of ethnocentrism. So to what extent are different cultures similar? And to what extent do we judge other cultures from our own standpoints? So this is an empirical chapter, but you can also see cultural issues and the study of culture through all the theoretical lenses we've discussed. So for example, functionalists would often look at cultural universals, and they would look at maybe some of the positive or socially important roles that cultural things in our society play. So things like music, art, education. Functionalists may look at them historically and kind of suss out the functions that they play. Conflict theory may look at culture in terms of things more like culture wars or the oppression or domination of certain cultural minorities over others. And then symbolic interactionism could be how different aspects of culture are looked at and used by people. So a study of gamers under a symbolic interactionist approach could maybe hang out at video game stores and tournament venues and just see kind of how people attribute meaning to the process of playing video games. So a question to kind of put these things in perspective: what exactly do sociologists mean when they talk about culture? Outline and briefly discuss the defining features of culture. Remember, norms, values, and so on. How would you describe Canadian culture, and how does it differ from American culture? Chapter 6, Socialization. So socialization is seen as the process that makes us human. We're born wherever we are, and we become whoever we are through a process of learning social norms, rules, values, beliefs from our parents, from the education system, from our friends, even from frenemies and strangers, and so on. So it begins with asking you to consider just how much of you do you think is the product of inherent characteristics, so things you're born with, things you just are, or things we develop through social interaction. So while biologically oriented theories underscore the role that genetics play in defining behaviors, sociologists tend to challenge many biologically based assumptions. Not that they outright reject them, but more that they're just interested, again here, drawing on either macro or micro approaches, really looking at the role that social facts, social institutions, social processes play in creating individual behavioral differences. So some of the themes discussed in this chapter that you'll recall then are nature versus nurture debate. Again, how much of stuff is in our nature versus how much of the stuff outside of us becomes the stuff inside of us. The process of socialization itself, so again, learning symbols, learning values, learning beliefs, and translating that into kind of internally driven action. Social interaction, so talking with other people, interacting, writing, and so on. And evolutionary psychology. Again, this is a branch of research which has many of the same questions as sociologists, but looks more, rather than looking at social institutions as necessarily kind of outside of our biology, evolutionary psychology tries to link these two more. And again, if sociologists sometimes think this approach goes too far in that regard, and evolutionary psychologists sometimes think sociologists don't take evolution and biology seriously. So again, as we'll see, and a theme in the course I discussed was different disciplines make different assumptions about human behavior. So the chapter ultimately discusses the role, the major thing is that the major role of social institutions and what they play in helping us become functioning members of society. So the four main agents the four primary agents of socialization, again, were the family. So again, we're all born into families of some sort, even if we're adopted, or we have some sort of guardian in our society, and those raise us to some extent. We have peers, so like-minded individuals that are our age, typically friends at school, again, just the word peers, it's hard to get around it, just people you know in your class. School more generally, so the ideas that you're formally taught, the way that your teacher could act as a role model, or the cool kids in school could act as the role models, your peers, going back to peers. And then the media. So I kept kind of harping on Disney in many classes, just, not them specifically, but just an idea that the media very much influences how we think and act when we think, what's popular, who looks cool, what do I want to act like, what am I tabooing? So a question from this chapter, just to kind of put these ideas in mind, how might the agents of socialization, so again, things like the family and the school, how might they reinforce the same message? Using specific examples, explain how two or more agents of socialization present contradictory messages to an individual. So how may your parents and your peers define cool? Imagine they both had to say, okay, Sammy, I want you to be the most lit kid in town. Do you think your parents and your peers would say the same thing? Do you think I would say the same thing if I'm part of like education and I'm an agent of socialization? Is Lawrence's definition of lit the same as, I don't know, Bobby's or something? Okay, chapter 7, social inequality. And so in this chapter, we start to discuss the concept of social inequality, and which is based on social stratification. Again, kind of in dialogue with the functionalist perspective that sees society as this big whole with all these organs. The study of social inequality says, okay, why is it that some organs are bigger than others? Why is it that certain individuals benefit from some organs differently from others? We're not all slicing this pie or this human cadaver, I guess. We're not slicing it all equally. Some people are getting more of it than others. And some parts of the body are getting more attention from doctors than others. So while there's some discussion of global inequality, this chapter does focus more on the Canadian context. In addition to just looking at social stratification, so how pieces of the pie are given out, we also look at the issue of closed versus open societies. So remember, Canada is an open system. We have a democracy. People can have what's called social mobility, so moving up. This, as we see, is often influenced by people's family wealth and income and education. So the extent to which the society is actually open was challenged. Open societies were contrasted with closed societies, so countries that have caste systems, so lack of social mobility, for example, the Indian caste system. Looking at poverty, we saw that the two approaches that are often taken on the ground level by individuals to explain poverty are either blaming the victim or blaming the system. So blaming the victim, again, was the idea of putting the individual at the center and saying, well, you're homeless because you made the wrong choices or you didn't go to school. Blaming the system would then say, well, you're homeless because you didn't have access to resources, you were kicked out, looking for some variable that's more systemic. So as we discussed, if we blame the victim, our argument holds that essentially the poor just need to work harder to achieve our normative ideas of success. Approaches that blame the system focus on systemic discrimination against certain peoples that tend to be poor. And again, contemporary sociology, we're never blaming the victim, but I think many studies try to see, okay, which aspects of the system are actually responsible for this, and how might individuals best navigate the terrain that they find themselves in. So a question to think about going forward: identify and discuss at least 5 factors that affect social inequality in Canada. Which is the most important factor in determining social inequality, and which do you think is more tangential or not as important? Justify your choices. Okay, chapter 8, gender. Many people, including all of you, tend to use, or most of you, I'm assuming, tend to use the terms sex and gender. Many people also, maybe that didn't take Socio 3, use them synonymously, however. So here in sociology, we see sex and gender is quite different. Namely, sex is a biological aspect of a person, and gender is a social construction. So you're born with a biological sex, but you perform a gender that may or may not mix with that. So the chapter discusses how individuals that do not fit in with the normative constructions of sex gender, so for example, someone that's born male but identifies as a girl or a woman, so a transgender individual, how they may have a lot of hardship in their lives for that. They may automatically come to feel and be treated as other than other individuals. So we discussed the concepts of hegemonic masculinity and emphasized femininity here to explain this process. So this was where we talked about movies again. I won't say the company because I don't want to get sued, but we talked about movies that portrayed men as stereotypical, as like interested in stereotypically attractive women that were tended to be very seemingly passive, childlike, and the men were very aggressive. And similarly, the women were seemed to be attracted to men that could care for them and take on the protective role. So hegemonic masculinity is this idea that there's a kind of narrow parameter of characteristics, traits, attitudes that a man should have, and emphasized femininity is very similar but regarding women and females. This chapter also drew connections to how gender connects with race and social class, and drew on the classical theories and many of the contemporary theories to make the argument that the kind of pressure that individuals feel to have a sex-gender match can be more or less severe based on where someone finds themselves in the class hierarchy. So bell hooks and third-wave feminists really talked about the experiences of Black women and many other individuals who felt strong pressures to perform certain kinds of femininity or masculinity. So just a question going forward to think about this. So is sex as a concept as simple as you may have thought it was before reading this text on gender? So what kinds of issues complicate the general understanding of sex as a binary concept? Using appropriate examples, explain your position fully. So remember, we also talked about, even though how sex can be seen as male, female, intersex by many individuals, the fact that gender is not only being masculine, feminine, identifying as a girl or a boy, but is much more of a spectrum, and sex and gender don't have to align. How much does the idea of sex as a binary, what does that say to you now that you've read about these ideas on gender and discussed this throughout the year? So continuing on this idea, Chapter 9, Sexualities. So while Chapter 8 mainly discussed the social construction of gender, Chapter 9 now builds on what I was just saying about the not necessarily the construction of sex, but more of sexualities. So gay, straight, and other sexualities as we've seen. So some of the key issues here were sexuality, sexual orientation, the gay liberation movement, the sexual double standard, and the racialized sexual double standard. So keeping all of these ideas in mind, the key kind of thing that was given in this was that sexualities are socially constructed. So there are 5 possible sexualities according to the textbook. Homosexual, so that's same-sex attraction. Heterosexual, that's liking someone of the opposite sex. Bisexual, that's liking individuals of both sexes. And then pansexual and asexual. So these last ones are slightly more complex. But again, pansexual is someone whose sexual interaction, their attraction can vary, and they can like individuals that are transgender. They can like cisgender individuals, so people whose male and whose sex at birth and gender align. And then asexual individuals who may not want physical contact, although they may want companionship. We also discuss monogamy and polygamy. So monogamous relationships, again, the kind of historical tradition in Canada of people getting married to one partner versus polygamy and polyamorous relationships. So thinking of people having multiple partners. So a question to think about going forward with this for studying: what are 3 potential sexual identities noted in the text? Describe each in enough detail to distinguish each from the others. Do you know people who identify with a different sexuality than your own? How, if at all, does your relationship with this person differ from your relationships with others who share your sexual identity? So again, here, the idea is to see a person's sexual identity, sexual orientation, sexuality, they're all kind of synonymous for the purpose of this course, to see a person's sexuality as socially constructed and structuring a person's life. Again, we're not saying that, because it's socially constructed, you can change it or anything like that easily. That's not the point. The point here is more to say, to what extent has a person's understanding of their own sexuality been shaped by wider social forces, and to what extent does that understanding come to influence their lives? Again, going back to the culture week, think of how different cultures may view sexuality, how they may view, for example, gay individuals, and how the internalization of that, remember the looking glass self, how internalizing ideas about how others view your sexuality, how that may impact your behavior. So chapter 10 then, race and racialization. In this chapter we learn that the dominant group in society tends to construct social terms around the themes of race and ethnicity and minorities. So here we learn about the issues that these groups face, and we first address this by asking, what is a minority? So the key themes discussed around race and racialization then are minority and majority. So again, not necessarily minority and majority in terms of like population numbers, but more, who gets a say in society, who has historically had social privilege, power, and how have people contributed to societal social solidarity. Remember the functionalist perspective that kind of everyone in society is part of a larger body. This chapter, focusing on race, starts to ask the question of, to what extent is everyone able to equally participate? So the process of racialization is discussed. So again, how certain individuals, certain groups become deemed as non-majority by way of having a different race or skin color. And how this could lead to internalized racism, so ideas about those minority groups being taught to those minority individuals, and then sometimes manifesting in things like internalized racial loathing, so not liking your own race, and other feelings of kind of larger sadness, and perpetuating of stereotypes even. And then seeing the difference between race and ethnicity. So again, race typically being this more fixed, phenotypical term, whereas ethnicity is something more you can opt into. So, if you if you have like many people, if you have a complex kind of racial background, or you come from, your family comes from many different places, often you'll choose kind of what culture you identify most with. So your ethnicity is more fluid than your race in that way, usually. So a question to think about when looking at the process of racialization and the chapter, race and racialization. How are prejudice and discrimination different from one another? So remember, we discussed prejudice is the idea that you could have certain views and stereotypes about people, but you don't necessarily act them out. Discrimination is acting in a way that is hurting or oppressing another individual, typically discriminating against someone. But you don't necessarily have to know that you're doing that. So describe a scenario where a person could be prejudiced against a group of people, but not discriminate. And then describe a scenario where one could actually be doing something discriminatory, but they may not actually have a prejudicial view against that group of people. Might either of these scenarios be in your future? So could you imagine yourself in either of these ideas, being either the victim or the perpetrator of these things? So again, just think, okay, how may I have been prejudiced in the past, or how was I the victim of someone's prejudice? And how, or the target, and how have I ever been discriminatory in any regards in someone's life, or have they done that to me? Or in the future, how could you imagine that impacting your life in some way? Chapter 11, families. So families are not as simple as an idea as many people may think. So we see in this course over the year that the definition of family has changed over time. And right now, particularly, as we discuss in this chapter, as cohabiting couples are very much increasing and marriage rates are declining, the idea of the kind of stereotypical nuclear family of a mother and a father and 2+ children, that has been changing quite a bit with again, couples that are staying together without having legal marriage, and same-sex couples, and even multiple partner couples. All of these make the kind of classic nuclear family definition loosen a bit. So sociologists look at these processes through all of the theories we've discussed. An example of this, a functionalist could look at how different family structures evolved over time. A conflict theorist may question why, say, cohabitation versus legal marriage, or common law status versus legal marriage, why it took as long as it did to form, why it formed at certain moments when it did. Post-structuralists and queer theorists may look at things more like gay marriage and queer families and things, and question some of the inequalities that they face. And so ultimately this class, this week on families, discusses all of the things that kind of make families what they are. So again, the norms and historical things that happened to kind of create that nuclear family moment. Remember the Industrial Revolution I talked about, the separation of spheres, women often staying at home, minding the home and children, while men went and worked in factories, and then over time that trickling into this kind of rigid divisions, which also aligned with gender stereotypes that were being both created and reinforced. So the family is really, again, a microcosm of society where social norms are passed on and transferred, but also social change can happen as people kind of question their parents and parents question their children. Question just in terms of, to bring this to home, how would you define the term family? What kinds of problems does one encounter when defining, and what kind of challenges come when you're trying to define a term that often seems so intuitive? So building on kind of, again, this agent of socialization, in chapter 12 we discuss education. So many relevant and interesting topics for you in a sociology class are addressed in this chapter. So here are the origins of public education in Canada. Remember, we discussed kind of the bureaucratization of education, taking it out of the family and putting it in schools. We saw how that had many beneficial effects for people kind of moving up in terms of social mobility. But then we saw also how it was used to looking at culture through a conflict theory lens, how it was used to also really bolster certain individuals over others. So we saw the creation of residential schools, which impacted the lives of Indigenous Canadians quite harshly. Then we saw mass education, so the increasing spread of education. So looking at University of Toronto with its 3 campuses, looking at the tons of high schools, primary schools we have, and lot of laws against truancy, just seeing how education became this mass product that kind of everyone is supposed to have, with post-secondary enrollments going up, and then some issues being things like rising tuition rates, credential inflation, so people now feeling that university is often the new high school, and then now even people feeling pressured into having master's degrees, and then issues kind of related to me, so things like research and funding, and then that good old academic integrity. You remember our nice little contract we have on our academic integrity checklist, and the issue of now that students are in this situation where they have to go to school in order to feel to get decent employment. This often puts many students in a situation where they feel they may have to cheat to cope with this. So in addition to learning about these topics, we also looked at how industrialization, immigration, and Canadian economic development played a role in these processes. So this week was very empirical, and a lot of timely issues were brought up, and what we tried to do was nest it again in this kind of post-industrial or early industrial and then later post-industrial moment of time. So a question to think about: can you identify some examples of cultural capital from your own background and upbringing? So remember, we also discussed with education how certain individuals were more likely to succeed in higher education and education more generally. So people whose parents had gone to, quote unquote, better schools, so more prestigious schools, and have tutors and things like that, and could send their kids to private school, they often were able to instill kind of ways of approaching teachers. So helicopter parents would go and tell their kids, oh, if you get a bad grade, ask your teacher why, ask for extra help. So think of cultural capital again as a kind of cultural know-how. How do you talk to authority members? So think of your own life. Has cultural capital helped you in terms of in terms of your education? and what other kinds of cultural capital might have been useful for you but you didn't have in your family background. Chapter 13, religion. So here we were not interested in discussing, the validity or invalidity of any kind of religion, but rather we were looking at the origins of religion around the world. Remember, we looked at the work of Tyler, who discussed how religions tend to evolve in the following. So starting with animism, so some sort of spiritual idea in nature or in animals, then moving into polytheism, the idea of having multiple deities or gods, and then into monotheism, so things like Christianity, where you have God himself. Then we looked at new religious movements, sects, and churches. Sects we talked about before. These topics, again, were all discussed to kind of give you a big survey of what the world religions were, what values they have, and the process of secularization. So again, looking at Max Weber and his rationalization thesis, kind of building on Tyler in some ways, or not that they necessarily were in dialogue, but looking at how societies over time have tended to weed out religious views and replace them with scientific rational views. So now that's often a hot button issue for people, who are more interested in looking at the validity of religious claims than just studying it sociologically. The extent to which religious views should be taught in school, whether they're complementary with scientific views, and really, to what extent these sorts of origin questions are fruitful. So question, how does the sociology textbook that you use define religion? Using examples, critically assess the definition of religion in the text and develop your own. How does your definition compare to the one in the text? Chapter 14, crime, law, and regulation. So first, crime and deviance do not refer to the same thing. They're not interchangeable terms. For example, while some deviant behavior is classified as criminal, not all behaviors that have been defined as deviant are criminal. And this is quite obvious to think of it, right? So, for example, a deviant behavior could be murder, and that's also criminal because that's against the law. Whereas, if I'm at my desk and I start, eating my cheese string while I'm talking, and shaking and stuff, that may be deviant because I'm deviating from your expectation of what a professor should be doing in a study video, but it's not criminal, at least not yet. So deviant also was how I felt when I was deviating from my normal path, or the normal kind of student path when I dropped out of school and tried to be a pro gamer. Deviance, again, is veering away from norms. It can be criminal, but it doesn't have to be. And so this chapter becomes quite theoretical, looking at many explanations of both crime and deviance. So things like rational choice theory and biological determinism. Remember, rational choice theory emerging through the ideas of Jeremy Bentham and others in that Enlightenment period. Here, where people were casting off religious views, they started to think, okay, now that we've said people are rational and in charge of their decisions, we've ramped up the agency here and reduced the structure, we need to start looking at all these big crime problems. Because remember, this was also a time period in the 1700s, 1800s of tons of crime around the Western period at that time, and many other places, but that was the focus. So places like Britain, tons of crime, and people were saying, okay, now that we know we're liberated, this is happening because people are making these choices. And by lowering structures, lowering the weight of religious edicts and things, people now think, crime isn't as bad as it is, and they're not thinking that through. So the rational choice theory was about raising the punishment so that people knew that crime was bad, and it was, crime is against social order, people weren't always seeing it, so we kind of had to make them see it through the development of clear and consistent laws and codes. And that was against the idea of biological determinism, which was that, quote-unquote criminals are just born that way, and they have certain traits and proclivities that will make them more likely to engage in crime. So in terms of the classical kind of sociological theories that are used, functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism are all really major here, again, in seeing, what function does deviance have in society? Is it a way of just people letting off steam? What role does crime have? Does it actually brighten the boundaries that people have constructed and the norms and values? So for example, when I break a law, other people can rally together in their kind of public shaming or anger at my activities. Conflict theory looks at, why is it that certain individuals in the contemporary moment, why is it that racial minorities or men tend to be arrested and or men tend to be arrested more than women and majority individuals? What stakes are here? How does that link with gender ideas and racialized ideas about racialization? Symbolic interactionism, why does a person choose to do deviant behavior or crime? We also discussed the law, so Canadian law. Here we looked at crime, risk, and regulations. And so here we saw that the perception of crime and victimization are often shaped by the media. So again, the kind of news stories we see, the certain kind of individuals you may be afraid of, stereotypes there are, again, around race are very important to consider. So possible question here, identify and describe the 5 possible categories of adaptation to societal goals and means as identified by Merton in his strain theory, and provide an example of each. So remember, for Merton, a big source of crime and deviance was the fact that in American society, the society he was studying, that people share the same cultural goals, but they have different means of getting them. So really bringing in that social inequality, the materials from social inequality, the week on social inequality again. Think, the fact that in different neighborhoods, there are different amounts of jobs, different sources of education, private schools, public schools, and so on. Think of the cultural capital that groups have. Here, Merton looks at how this feeling of strain, feeling like I want, to have this, nice house, but I don't have the means of doing so in a legitimate way. I can't get the job, I can't get the schooling, so I may turn to crime. Or I may reject that goal and develop some other goal, which could be, deviant. It could be video gaming, it could be drug use, again, deviant in the terms of veering away from societal norms. Okay, so we're nearing the end. Chapter 15, Health, Aging, and Disabilities. So this chapter examines health, aging, disabilities, and the way that these 3 factors are all interconnected. So remember, according to the WHO, the World Health Organization, health is defined as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. So keeping this definition in mind, we see that health is much more than simply a biological phenomenon. Remember, looking at social well-being and your mental state, we know that these things are very much influenced by the kinds of relationships we have, the resources we have, the jobs we've had, the friends we've had, all of these sorts of things. So some things that are discussed in this chapter are life expectancy, health, and how social factors intertwine in this process. So again, things like income inequality, minority status, gender, looking at how these impact how healthy we feel. So aging is also discussed as well. So aging has become an important topic in our society because aging baby boomers do in fact constitute a very large proportion of our society. Topics of some relevance here, so looking at aging, are well-being. So as people are getting older, are they actually enjoying their lives? Are they feeling sick? Are they feeling isolated? Related to that is mental health and mental health issues, things like dementia, memory loss, but also solitude, feelings of being solitude, feeling alone, or feelings of being solitary. Financial pressures, so as a person ages, are they able to retire when they want? Is the transition into retirement healthy for them? When they suddenly quit their job, or are they given a longer period out? Ageism, so the feeling that people are discriminating against you because you're quote unquote old. And then more physical, again, things like chronic pain and even the preparation for death. So how do you sever the ties from your family and move on? With disabilities, again, we see how individuals with disabilities are also a minority group. Again, the minority in a demographic sense, the minority of individuals or a minority of individuals suffer from disability-related issues, but also those with disability become minority by kind of being marked as other and often having coterminous issues such as making less money and feeling stigmatized. So again, going back to the beginning of this lecture as a question, or both the lecture and this summary, how does the World Health Organization define health? Critically analyze their definition of health and explain how health is essentially a social construction when you start to see how even its biological aspects are very much shaped by the kind of lives we can lead based on our social positioning. Again, see, just like how agency is conditioned by structure, our self-determination is conditioned by the context around us. How much is our health conditioned by that as well? It's basically what I'm asking. Chapter 16, Work and the Political Economy. So as you know, this was my major area in my dissertation. Again, I interviewed people who felt stuck in their jobs. So this chapter was all about work and how both our need to work, our desire to work, our ideas of work are shaped by the economy and society that we're in. So this chapter, we went through different kinds of societies, going from gathering and hunting all the way to post-industrial. So again, we looked at societies that were very nomadic and small scale to now an economy that's dominated by what's called like knowledge jobs. So as societies became increasingly complex, as the division of labor separated tasks, people moved from having more physical, object-based and location-based jobs to now more intellectual, idea-based and interconnected jobs. People can work around the world via Skype and web tools like WebEx, and even just by email and phone and telecommunications. Even though jobs have become less physical, it doesn't mean they've become less menial for people. So many individuals are what's called precariously employed, meaning that they don't have stable employment. Things like unions have arisen over time, labor unions where groups of workers get together to try to set bureaucratized in the sense of having clear guidelines on pay, promotion schemes, vacation days, and things like that. So even though labor unions historically have tried to get rid of precarious conditions, many individuals still do find themselves in what we call MIC jobs, so jobs that are seen as more transitory, less permanent, not having benefits, and things like that. So all of you in university, as much as you may be here, as we discussed in the Higher Education Week, as much as you may be here to learn sociology and other fields for their own sake, you're also here to avoid getting stuck in those sorts of jobs that don't allow you to kind of exert your agency and live the lives you want. So many different many different theories were discussed here, but I think a key one was conflict theory, looking at to what extent can people actually work jobs that they want? Why do individuals have to work the way that they do, in the conditions that they do? What is a good job exactly? And what are the qualities that define bad jobs? And how are those related kind of to our capitalist economy? So in terms of the question, I mentioned the idea of bureaucracy again. So remember, Max Weber talked about this process of rationalization, the secularization of society, being religious ideas, more quote-unquote mystical ideas, kind of being weaned out of society and replaced by rationalized codes of conduct, laws, clear rules, and systems. So what are the defining features of bureaucracies as identified by Weber? So go through the chapter and find those. And be sure to describe each feature of bureaucracy clearly. So here again, try to connect multiple chapters with this. Think, what is a bureaucracy to Weber? How does it link in the process of societal development discussed in this chapter? So again, going from hunting and gathering to post-industrialism, and what are its components? And then going more broadly, think, what effects have the contemporary societal bureaucracy had on how people work, on even our ideas of sex and gender, of religion, and so on. Again, I'm opening up this question a bit, but just to try to, now that we're getting closer to the end, unfortunately, just to kind of help you draw more connections. So chapter 17, media. So you all, you're all lit on your phones all the time. So in this chapter, we discuss the whole history of media, going from block printing all the way up to, Skyping and YouTubing and social networking and all of that. We discussed many Canadian insights here. So we looked at Innes and McLuhan and CanCon. So remember, we looked at hot and cold media. So again, media that's designed to really capture one sense. So my lectures, for example, I'm really supposed to engage you intellectually. Versus things like Twitter and Facebook, where you may be seeing images, you may be hearing noises. Something could be more like a newspaper. Another aspect could be more like a personal blog post. Another one could be a film. So kind of saturated from all sides. And we looked here at Canadian content legislation. So, to what extent can television shows really capture the culture of a society that really bases itself on multiculturalism? I talked about TIFF and many Indigenous initiatives, but to what extent have those kind of penetrated into or made their way into the mainstream, the quote-unquote mainstream culture? How much do you see those movements impacting you? So this chapter then moves on to discuss the future of media. So again, we've seen media ultimately is a story of communication. So through early forms of printing, early forms of writing, cave arts, all the way to now tweeting and being on social media. The key that people were trying to do is, communicate point A to point B to person B. So media are the way, media is plural. Again, I said it's kind of awkward when you're saying it, but whether your medium is writing or speaking or art or research, all of these are ways of communicating symbolic ideas from one person to another. When discussing the future of this, again, we think what new media will be available and whose ideas will be getting out there. We'll be thinking about this more with globalization at the end, but here, are the ideas of dominant classes, dominant countries, are those going to spread more through the media or through kinds of media? Or are people going to become more democratic over time? We don't have the answers to that, but using your theoretical lenses, start to ask some of those questions. So a question here, specifically looking toward the future of mass media, and based on the issues noted in the text, what do you think will become the most important issue in the next 10 years? Explain why you chose as you did. Chapter 18, social change, collective behavior, and social movements. So here we learned about social change broadly, and then how social change can be seen as the product of collective behavior and social movements. So here we looked again at social change as being, a kind of inevitable product of humans living in societies. So norms change, beliefs change, values change. And then we saw how these processes that are inevitable, they don't just happen on their own, but they happen either through collective behavior, so people either forming localized collectivities, so people mobbing, or through dispersed collective behavior, so people getting together online, so tweeting together, liking each other's posts and stuff. So we see that social change can happen through collective behavior. So you could all mob against someone to have them removed from the university, so someone like me, but please don't. Or you could, do that online. So collective behavior is one way social change can happen, but social movements, even though these often underlie collective behavior, they can be a different way. So social movements, as we saw, tend to be rested more on long-term change, whereas collective behavior is short-term. So for example, using this thing I hope doesn't happen. Let's say you mobbed against me. That was your collective behavior for the one end of getting Lawrence out. That could have been part of a broader social movement of, say, students running the university. That social movement may not be there, but if that social movement is already growing, the collective behavior will probably have more resonance with people. So I use the example of the potential snow snow day we could have had on February 27th, and how some students asked me to change the date of the test, and I told them I didn't have the power to do that, and the students were very respectful of me, and they believed me, luckily, but I was very worried, thinking that, you know, maybe they would get together, a bunch of students that were angry about this, and get together, people wouldn't write the test, and you know, what would I do? I didn't want them thinking that I was causing this when I really had no say, but luckily that didn't happen, and you guys are awesome, and everyone showed up, but you know, that if there was a social movement against professors at U of T, or, you know, against me and other certain select few people, then, you know, you could have mobilized and had that collective behavior against me. So that's how these two things often work, right? If there's a big social movement that's going on, an instance like that may have sparked people to act collectively and say, okay, now's our chance to get nasty Lawrence. So we talked about crowds, mobs, riots, again, a lot of localized collectives, and then more dispersed ones, so things like online social groups, liking, hashtagging, but also things like fads, fashion, and just legends you hear. So again, things, collectives, groups, they don't always have to be in person, they can exist online. We talked about a lot of really cool theories, so contagion theory, convergence theory. Again, these were theories of how these ideas spread. So does social change, is it more the product of, you know, someone giving an idea and then other people just kind of passively absorbing it? Or is it convergence? Is it a bunch of people, do they decide to enter into a social movement or a collectivity based on views that they personally already had? Or is it more a combination of the two in emergent norm theory? And then some theories we discussed, we concluded with some theories to social movements. So relative deprivation theory, mass society theory, and resource mobilization theory. So again, looking at social movements as being the product of people either noting that certain individuals are being deprived from kind of public goods more than others. Mass society theory, very kind of Durkheimian, the idea that people eventually will realize how alienated they're feeling, you know, feeling anomic in society, and then get together from that. And then resource mobilization theory, seeing that social movements are successful based on how many resources people can mobilize towards those ends. So I mentioned that the vast bulk of social movements, even though they're meant to endure, or the proponents of them want them to endure, they don't often endure. And so resource, which basically means the social movement it's not fully effective. And resource mobilization theory would state that part of why they're not effective is that the members didn't have the time, they didn't have the money, they didn't have the intellectual clout or like a public figure backing them to the extent, or they had a lot of opposition. So there was kind of like negative resources out there. So in terms of a question here, so we talked about social change. This may seem a bit off, but remember we opened the lecture with the discussion of digital natives and digital immigrants. So remember, most of you being born in a time where you have smartphones already, or smartphones came out around that time, computers, living in a tech era, versus digital immigrants, so individuals who kind of always have an accent with technologies, maybe a bit awkward, may opt for pen and paper over a computer and so on. So compare and contrast digital natives and digital immigrants. In answering this question, make sure you describe in detail how digital natives and digital immigrants respond to technology differently. Do you think this has been the case with other forms of technology in the past? In the future, when your own children are using a new technology that we have not invented yet, might you resist using it? Use examples to support your response. So again, think one major social change has been the kind of onslaught of technology onto our lives, both for good and bad. And in this question, just think, okay, do you think that, how do you think new digital technologies will be received by people? And what exactly are the differences between people born in a time where they're really enmeshed in technologies versus ones who started adopting technologies later? And you're a digital native, but there will still be you may be a digital native now, but as the question is asking you, when you have, if or when you have children and new technologies come out, may you become a digital immigrant with their technologies? So now for the final two chapters, So chapter 19, globalization. Remember I said this was more of a meta week, so we really, this week covers a lot of the weeks we've already discussed, but now shifts the context from looking at kind of single societies to everywhere. So here the central questions are, to what extent are countries interconnected? Where do our ideas of borders come from? What are meant by the terms, developed, developing, underdeveloped, the global north, the global south? Why was there a shift from seeing countries as arranged in terms of first world, second world, and third world to then the global north and global south? And how have all of these changes been impacted by technology? So the key factors that we saw discussed this week were technological change, political change, and economic change. To reiterate, technological developments tended to, or were the catalyst for large-scale globalization. We discussed how modern globalization as we know it began in the 16th century, but really started to take off in the 20th century. So telecommunications in particular made it so that, well, after airplanes and things, but really at a mass scale, made it so that geographical distance became minimized. However, the idea that people are now connected, so you can talk to people in Facebook Messenger instantly around the world, you can fly relatively cheaply anywhere. This idea of loosening borders also created and exacerbated other issues. So things like global poverty, even including how we define it. We talked about absolute versus relative poverty. Again, can you put food on the table? Do you have a table to put the food on? Versus, are you making, what someone of the average income level would earn in your country, or someone with any sort of job, minimum wage job? All of these categories start to become complicated in the context of globalization, but also exacerbated. So when you think of, buying clothes that may have been made in sweatshops in other countries, if you think of major poverty disparities in certain countries being kind of forced into technological development or being brought in later, depending on your perspective, all of these things are issues that are discussed in this chapter. And the final kind of outcome we discussed was the homogenization of cultures. So does the kind of breaking down of boundaries between cultures, more tourism, more moving around, more immigration, does that lead to cultures potentially becoming more similar? And if so, are they naturally becoming similar, or are certain cultural values becoming more dominant? Remember, we talked about the dominance of Western mass media. Is that kind of co-opting other cultures into being similar to the West? And if so, is that promoting Eurocentrism? So another question, just a final wrap up to think about this chapter. What is the concept of cosmopolitanism? Are you more cosmopolitan than your parents are? Are you more cosmopolitan than your grandparents are? Predict what this might mean for your children and grandchildren. And lastly, so sad, but a good way to end, environmental sociology, chapter 20. So environmental sociology is the study of the interaction between human society and the physical environment. It's a relatively new addition to the discipline of sociology. Many textbooks didn't used to have this. So this talks about the role, namely that anthropocentrism has played in shaping the environment and environmental racism. So anthropocentrism is essentially seeing humans as at the center of the world. So now when society is largely rejecting this view of saying, we, our species, are damaging the planet, making many animals go extinct, we start to see how, we start to see how this role as humans as being at the center of the world is causing a lot of damage. On that note of damage to the environment, we also look at environmental racism. So this is where much pollution and environmental damage and hazardous activity is often offloaded onto poor countries. And so poor countries will have higher levels of air pollution and so on due to the way factories are positioned from Western and other countries. So again, this chapter continues from the theme of globalization and kind of the globalization of poverty and inequality, and saying we're also doing it to the environments, not even just the kind of social economies in those countries. So many theories were discussed in this chapter as well. So things like modernization theory or ecological modernization theory, ecofeminism, deep ecology. Essentially, these are all different theories that look at to what extent is modernization good for the environment? To what extent should humans be trying to see themselves as more interwoven and connected with their natural environments? So it's a big, broad question, just to tie up a lot of themes, but ending with the environment. Explain the relationship between capitalism, urbanization, so again, building cities, and we're going back to the Industrial Revolution, and the environment. So think, how does capitalism and the growth of cities, again, the centralizing labor and things like that, how does that impact the environment? And how could things maybe look different? Well, that's the end of all of my lectures in the textbook. I think this has been about, this has been about an hour and a half long video. I really tried to pack things in. I didn't want to say too much, too little. I know you guys always want, my students, you want a study guide. I still don't know what that quite looks like. And to be honest, I don't think I ever had a study guide in undergrad. So things have changed. I'm a study guide immigrant, using my native digital immigrant term from Penske, the book. I hope I wish everyone the best on the final exam and going forward in your lives. If this is the last video for the class, I very, very much enjoyed teaching all of you and learning from you too. More of you could have come to my office hours, but it's okay. I know how busy you are, and especially having, the web option. I'm really happy I did that, but I know that for some of you that weren't coming physically to class, it makes sense that you wouldn't come to office hours either. So I hope you remember, again, the take-homes. View each lecture in this week as really a take-home from, these are 20, you covered like 20 areas of sociology, and to try to test yourself, what I would really do is listen to the summary of each chapter in the video, attempt to answer the essay question. As you're doing so, then go to my lecture notes and go to your lecture notes and my lecture slides covering that material. And then anything that's unclear, go to the specific part of the text where concepts that were discussed were kind of unclear to you. And then keep doing that until less and less concepts are unclear. Now again, in this video, I have tried to narrow down, hint, the idea, the level of concepts that we'll be discussing. So in terms of a study guide, I would view this kind of as a pretty clear study guide. Of course, there will be things that I haven't mentioned that are testable. You are responsible for reading the whole text, and I hope you're intrinsically motivated to do so anyway. I do know it's a long class, like being a full year with 20 chapters, so I have tried to narrow that down here. But I would say start with the video, try to do the essay questions, and then go through the lecture slides, and then go through the text for anything that's unclear. So please stay in touch with me. If I don't see you again in sociology, you'll see me at the final exam, so you can say hi to me then. But going forward, I mean it. Shoot me an email. I don't know where I'll be. Right now I'm teaching at UTSC, but you never know where I'll be. I hope you all major in sociology, and even if you don't, I hope everything goes amazing for you. All right, see ya, and thanks for being such a fantastic class.